The summer of 1952 in St. Mildred's was one of those blessed English summers that seemed to have been painted by Turner himself. Golden light flooding meadows, roses tumbling over stone walls, and bees humming lazily in gardens where the air was rich with lavender and thyme. It was the sort of place one could almost forget the troubled, changing world beyond the hedgerows. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple had long since discovered, evil and tragedy could slip through even the prettiest of gardens as easily as a weed. On this particular June afternoon, Miss Marple was seated in the shaded parlour of her ivy-covered cottage in St. Mary Mead, a teacup balanced neatly in her hand. A letter lay unfolded on the table beside her. Its elegant script bore tidings of an invitation. She was to spend a fortnight at Havisham Manor, a grand estate belonging to her late friend, Lady Agatha Havisham. Lady Agatha's son, Sir Geoffrey, had extended the kindness, wishing her presence at the annual midsummer gathering that had long been a tradition in the county. Miss Marple, who had always possessed an almost supernatural intuition for where trouble might arise, felt a curious flutter of unease as she reread the letter. Havisham Manor had stood for 3 centuries, its grey stone walls and mullioned windows a picture of English history. But houses, Miss Marple knew, had their own tempers, like people, and she had heard whispers of disquiet about the Havishams of late. Far-fee arrival at Havisham Manor. The following day, Miss Marple was driven up the long avenue of lime trees leading to the manor. The great house appeared at the end, its reflection glimmering faintly in the ornamental lake. She was greeted at the grand front steps by Sir Geoffrey Havisham, a man of middle age with a broad frame, thinning sandy hair, and a genial smile that never quite reached his eyes. "My dear Miss Marple," he said warmly, bowing slightly as he offered his hand. "How good of you to come. Mother always spoke so highly of you." "You are very kind, Sir Geoffrey," Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes twinkling as she accepted his assistance up the steps. "I hope I shall not be too much in the way. A house full of young people, I dare say." "Indeed," Geoffrey chuckled. "My sister Diana, of course, and a few friends of the family. A lively party, you might say. I should warn you, Miss Marple, the younger set talk of little but theatre, politics, and love affairs. I find," Miss Marple said gently, "that young people are very much like their elders, though they prefer to use different words for the same sentiments." Geoffrey gave a somewhat awkward laugh, and Miss Marple was ushered into the great entrance hall. Her sharp gaze, though seemingly distracted by admiration for the grand staircase and the glittering chandelier, lingered a moment longer on a tall mirror, placed in an elaborate gilded frame at the far end of the corridor. It reflected the hall with almost unnerving clarity. That mirror. Geoffrey noticed her glance. "A family heirloom. Been in the house since the reign of Queen Anne. My mother insisted it was unlucky." "Really?" Miss Marple murmured, leaning slightly on her parasol. "How very curious." Fires served the guests' dinner that evening gathered the household in the long oak-panelled dining room. There were 6 guests in addition to Miss Marple. Each was introduced with a flourish by Diana Havisham, Sir Geoffrey's younger sister, a striking woman in her 30s with raven black hair, and a rather dramatic taste in gowns. There was Colonel Henry Redfern, a retired military man with an impressive moustache and a reputation for blunt opinions. His deep laugh was hearty, yet his eyes darted about the room as though weighing the company. Beside him sat Mrs. Eleanor Whitcombe, a wealthy widow in her 40s, expensively dressed, who seemed overly attentive to Geoffrey, her hand often brushing his arm as she spoke. Next came Mr. Lawrence Pritchard, a local solicitor, balding, pale, and bespectacled, whose conversation revolved around the value of estates and the intricacies of wills. Then there was Clara Winthrop, a pretty young woman of 20 with fair curls and a nervous manner. She was, as Diana confided, an old school friend invited for companionship. Clara seemed almost painfully shy, her hands fidgeting with her cutlery whenever she was spoken to. The last of the party was Destry, Bernard Foster, the village physician. He was in his early 40s, with an intelligent brow and steady manner, though Miss Marple fancied he was more observant than he let on. Together, they made up the household of Havisham Manor for the week. Miss Marple, quietly knitting through much of the after-dinner conversation, was content to let the patterns of human nature reveal themselves. She noted the widow's possessive glances at Geoffrey, the colonel's stiffening when politics were mentioned, Clara's timid deference to Diana, and the subtle silence of Dr. Foster whenever the topic of Lady Agatha's will was raised. The inciting incident. It was on the 3rd evening of Miss Marple's stay that calamity befell the household. A storm had broken over the countryside, thunder rattling the window panes, lightning flickering across the lawns. The guests had gathered after dinner in the drawing room for bridge and conversation. Geoffrey, having excused himself early, retired upstairs complaining of a headache. It was not until nearly midnight that the housemaid, pale and trembling, rushed into the drawing room. "Sir Geoffrey, sir, he's dead," she stammered. The household erupted in confusion. Miss Marple rose at once, her knitting slipping quietly into her handbag, and followed the others up the grand staircase. At the end of the corridor, near that great gilded mirror, Sir Geoffrey lay sprawled upon the floor. His head rested at an odd angle, his eyes wide open in a glassy stare. The mirror reflected his lifeless form with chilling accuracy. "What happened?" Diana cried, clutching the doorframe. "It looks like a fall," Colonel Redfern muttered grimly. "Perhaps struck his head." But Miss Marple, kneeling gently beside the body, noted something curious. There was no sign of blood, no outward wound. A small glass lay shattered nearby, and a faint scent lingered in the air. She raised her head, her expression thoughtful. Dr. Foster bent over Geoffrey, checking pulse and breath, and finally looked up. "I fear he has been poisoned," he said gravely. At this a silence descended, broken only by the roll of thunder outside. Diana gave a sharp cry. Whitcomb collapsed into a chair, pressing a handkerchief to her face. Clara whimpered softly, while Colonel Redfern's jaw tightened. Miss Marple's eyes strayed once more to the great mirror in its gilded frame. It seemed to stare back at her, reflecting the frightened faces gathered around the corpse. "A poisoned glass," she murmured to herself. "And a mirror that has seen much, yes. I daresay we shall need to look very closely indeed." The first shadow of murder had fallen across Havisham Manor. Pfeiffer investigae investigatium best. The hours following Sir Geoffrey's sudden death descended into a fog of disbelief and hushed speculation. Havisham Manor, with its panelled corridors and cavernous drawing rooms, seemed to tighten about its occupants like a net. The storm that had raged through the night had passed by morning, leaving a washed, pale sky above the drenched lawns, yet inside the house the air was heavy, tense, and thick with suspicion. At 8:30, the police arrived from the nearby market town. Inspector Graves, a stocky man with thinning hair and an expression of wary competence, accompanied by Sergeant Ellison, a tall, eager fellow with a notebook at the ready. They were shown at once to the room where Sir Geoffrey's body had been placed, and there conferred in low tones with Dr. Foster, who seemed to have assumed a certain authority over proceedings. Miss Marple, knitting placidly in a corner of the drawing room, listened to the muffled voices and reflected on Inspector Graves' reputation. He was known to be sensible, practical, and inclined to prefer straightforward explanations. Such a man, she mused, might be persuaded toward the idea of an accidental fall, or even a tragic mistake with drink. But Miss Marple had already noted two things: the faint, but unmistakable odor of bitter almonds on Geoffrey's lips, and the curious positioning of the great mirror, which reflected some portions of the hallway yet left others hidden. The official enquiry. By mid-morning, the household had been summoned to the library for questioning. Diana Havisham, pale but composed in a silk dressing gown, presided from a chair near the fire. Colonel Redfern paced like a caged lion, his heavy boots clicking on the parquet. Miss Whitcomb dabbed her eyes theatrically with a lace handkerchief, while Clara Winthrop clung silently to the edge of a sofa, her face blotched from crying. Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "Sir Geoffrey Havisham is dead, that much is certain. Dr. Foster is of the opinion that poison was involved. We shall, of course, require a full post-mortem, but I must ask each of you to account for your movements last night." There followed the usual recital of alibis and half-truths. Diana claimed she had been in her room writing letters. Colonel Redfern had retired to the smoking room with a decanter of whiskey. Mrs. Whitcomb insisted she had been occupied with embroidery, though no one had seen her. Clara, trembling, said she had gone upstairs early but had not been able to sleep. Dr. Foster explained he had been reading medical journals until summoned by the maid. Miss Marple, listening with lowered eyes, made mental notes of the hesitations, the nervous glances, the too ready certainties. She knew well that truth and falsehood wore different garments, and these garments did not always fit comfortably. 5 observations after the questioning, the household was left to its own devices. The police withdrew to consult, and Miss Marple, with an air of benign distraction, began her quiet patrol of the manor. She had a gift for making herself seem harmless, even invisible, though her eyes missed nothing. In these eyes' library, she found Diana hastily thrusting a sheaf of papers into the fire.
"Oh, Miss Marple!"
You startled me. I do beg your pardon, my dear, Miss Marple said mildly, adjusting her spectacles. I was admiring the bindings on those volumes. Such handsome leather. Diana laughed too quickly. Old bills and receipts, nothing of importance. The flames licked greedily at the edges of paper. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the curling script for a moment before she turned away. Bills indeed. Or perhaps letters better unseen. In this morning room, Mrs. Whitcomb sat alone, her fingers tracing the silver frame of a photograph of Geoffrey. She started when Miss Marple entered. "Most dreadful business," Mrs. Whitcomb murmured, her voice husky. "Geoffrey was such a dear friend. I cannot imagine who could wish him harm." Miss Marple's head tilted, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Friendship, Mrs. Whitcomb, can be a most delicate plant. It requires just the right soil to flourish. Too little attention, and it withers; too much, and it may choke." Mrs. Whitcomb flushed crimson. "You suggest—" "I hardly know what you mean, my dear," Miss Marple replied serenely. "I mean only that people often care in different ways than they profess." She observed how the widow's fingers clutched the photograph, almost possessively, before quietly excusing herself. Near the R stables, Miss Marple encountered Colonel Redfern, muttering curses beneath his breath as he inspected the saddles. "Dashed nonsense," he growled when he noticed her. "All this talk of poison. Geoffrey was a fool with drink, likely poured himself the wrong thing. Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "though one does not usually confuse brandy with cyanide." The Colonel glared. "Blast it, ma'am, I've seen men drop in far stranger ways on campaign. But mark me, Geoffrey was reckless. He owed me— well, never mind that. Best not to speak ill of the dead." Yet the Colonel's flushed cheeks and tightly clenched fist spoke volumes to Miss Marple. Later, in the Zuz upstairs corridor, Miss Marple came upon Clara Winthrop, standing quite still before the great gilded mirror. The girl's pale reflection stared back at her as though it were a stranger. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "doesn't it feel horrid? As if it saw everything?" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand upon her arm. "Mirrors can be cruel things, my dear. They show us ourselves when we would rather not look." Clara's eyes filled with tears. I heard Geoffrey in the corridor last night. He laughed at me. Said I was a silly little fool to think he'd ever— Oh, I can't say it. And now he's dead." She fled down the passage, leaving Miss Marple gazing thoughtfully at the mirror's ornate frame. For quiet deduction, by late afternoon, the inspector had departed, promising to return once the post-mortem was complete. The household tried to resume some semblance of normalcy, though conversation lagged, and the sound of the clock ticking in the hall seemed unnaturally loud. Miss Marple sat once more with her knitting, but her mind was busy. She considered. Geoffrey's glass had been poisoned. He had not been one to pour himself brandy habitually, at least, not without prompting. Someone must have offered it to him, and the mirror, with its curious angle, had reflected the corridor, but not the entire table. A clever murderer might have relied upon that illusion, knowing that those who later recalled the scene would believe Geoffrey had served himself. Her eyes moved from one guest to another as they sat in uneasy company. The widow dabbing at her eyes, the Colonel gruff and restless, Diana aloof, Clara trembling, Dr. Foster calm and competent. Each had their secrets, their sorrows, their resentments. But one, Miss Marple thought, had more to lose than all the rest. And so the threads began to tangle, as Miss Marple's keen needles worked silently on. The investigation had only just begun, but already the shape of the pattern was forming in her mind. Faf and Yes. The following day dawned grey and damp, with mist drifting low across the lawns. Inside Havisham Manor, the atmosphere was darker still. The shadow of Geoffrey's death lay heavily upon the household, yet it was not grief alone that troubled the air. There was fear now. Fear of suspicion, fear of exposure, fear of the unknown. Inspector Graves had returned early, bringing word that the preliminary examination confirmed Dr. Foster's suspicion. Geoffrey had died of cyanide poisoning. Suicide, the inspector hinted, could not be ruled out. Men of means, he said gravely to the assembled company in the dining room, sometimes take matters into their own hands. Debts, disappointments, who can say what weighed on Sir Geoffrey's mind? The suggestion was met with varying responses. Diana stiffened, her lips curling with disdain. "My brother was many things, Inspector, but not a coward. He would never have done such a vulgar thing." Mrs. Whitcomb wept afresh into her handkerchief. Colonel Redfern gave a derisive snort. Clara hid her face. Dr. Foster said nothing at all, merely folding his hands. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, regarded Inspector Graves with quiet amusement. "Suicide is often convenient to suppose," she said softly. "It saves the trouble of asking disagreeable questions. But in my experience, when something looks too simple, it rarely is." The inspector, unused to being corrected by an elderly lady in lace cuffs, colored slightly. "We shall see, madam, we shall see." The fanfifi the widow's letters. Later that morning, a discovery was made that set tongues wagging. One of the maids, while tidying Mrs. Whitcomb's room, stumbled upon a bundle of letters bound with a blue ribbon. These were promptly handed over to Inspector Graves, who upon perusal, found them to be love letters, written by Mrs. Whitcomb herself to Geoffrey. The letters spoke of devotion, longing, and promises of marriage. They also hinted at jealousy, referring to Geoffrey's flirtations with younger women, and Mrs. Whitcomb's fear of being cast aside. Confronted with these, Mrs. Whitcomb flushed crimson. "Yes, I cared for him," she admitted. "I believed he meant to marry me. If he had, well, I should have been secure. But he toyed with my affections. That does not make me a murderess. Yet jealousy is a powerful motive." Inspector Graves pressed. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner, observed how Mrs. Whitcomb clutched her pearls, her knuckles white. It was passion, certainly, but whether the passion of love or of desperation, Miss Marple reserved judgment. Far by the Colonel's debts by afternoon, further scandal surfaced. Colonel Redfern's finances, it transpired, were not what they seemed. Geoffrey had owed the Colonel a considerable sum from their evenings of cards and wagers. In truth, it was the Colonel who had pressed Geoffrey for repayment. When accused, the Colonel bristled. "Yes, I played cards with the man. Yes, he owed me. But debts of honor are settled one way or another. I'd not stoop to poison for a few paltry pounds." Miss Marple noticed, however, how his hands shook as he lit his pipe. Pride wounded, honor stained, these, she thought, could drive a man to rashness. But again something did not quite fit. Clara's humiliation. That evening, Miss Marple found Clara Winthrop alone in the conservatory, her face pale in the moonlight. The girl turned swiftly, eyes red from crying. "Oh, Miss Marple, you must think me foolish," she said in a trembling voice. "But I cared for Geoffrey. I thought he might one day notice me properly. But he only laughed. He said I was a child, a silly little schoolgirl. I cannot forgive him for that. Humiliation can wound more deeply than any knife," Miss Marple said gently, taking her hand. "But resentment, my dear, does not make a murderer." Clara buried her face in her hands. "I only wished he might regret his words. I never wished him dead." Miss Marple believed her. Yet it was curious how the girl had been seen near Geoffrey's study that night, and how she spoke of him with equal parts love and bitterness. The doctor's confidence. Dr. Foster, meanwhile, continued to play the role of calm authority, attending the inspector, offering explanations, soothing nerves. But Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes, noted how carefully he avoided mention of Geoffrey's recent visit to his surgery. In conversation, she remarked, "It must be a great comfort, Dr. Foster, to be so trusted by your patients. The health of the village quite depends on you, I dare say." He inclined his head modestly. "One does one's best. Still," Miss Marple continued mildly, "there are those who might take advantage of such trust. Prescriptions, for example, are curious things, helpful, yet so easily misused." For the briefest instant, his expression tightened. Then the smile returned. "Indeed, madam. But I should hardly expect you to trouble yourself with such matters." Miss Marple only smiled back, her needles clicking softly. The mirror again that night. Sleep proved elusive for many. Colonel Redfern paced the corridors. Diana shut herself in her chamber. Mrs. Whitcomb drank heavily. Clara sobbed into her pillow. Miss Marple, however, sat in the dimly lit hallway, gazing thoughtfully at the great mirror. By day, it was merely ornate, ostentatious. By night, it seemed to brood, reflecting flickers of candlelight, and the occasional passing shadow. She rose and walked slowly along the corridor, studying the mirror's angle. From the far end, one could see the reflection of the drinks table, but not the decanters in their entirety, only enough to suggest they were there. Yes, she thought. A clever person might rely on that. If Geoffrey were seen lifting a glass, those watching in reflection might assume he had poured it himself. Yet in truth, another hand could have passed him the poisoned drink. It was, she reflected, rather like those village stories of second sight, where people saw what they thought was a ghost, when it was only a trick of candle and glass. Human perception, Miss Marple knew, was the most unreliable witness of all. A disturbing discovery, the next morning brought another revelation. Sergeant Ellison, Searching the sideboard in the dining room, found a small vial tucked behind the brandy decanter. Its contents, when tested, were revealed to be cyanide. "Proof enough!" Inspector Graves declared. "The poison was in the cabinet all along. Sir Geoffrey must have mistaken it for something else." But Miss Marple shook her head. "I think not, Inspector. For one thing, cyanide has a most distinctive smell. Even a careless man would not confuse it with brandy. And for another, why should the vial be hidden, unless someone wished it not to be found?" Graves frowned, but Miss Marple only smiled her faint, knowing smile. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Someone in that house had not only the motive and opportunity, but also the cunning to use the mirror as a shield, and though the others had shown passion, jealousy, pride, or heartbreak, Miss Marple suspected the truest motive was something far colder: self-preservation. The pattern of human behavior, she reflected, was much like her knitting. Strands that seemed at first tangled and meaningless gradually revealed a design, intricate, inevitable, unmistakable, and in this pattern, she was beginning to see clearly whose hand had guided the poison thread. 5 Fact Atheriasis and Radi Eringis. The household of Havisham Manor awoke the next morning to a strange silence, as though the great house itself held its breath. Rain had fallen through the night, and the garden was drenched, the roses bowed with water. In the dining room, the silver coffee service gleamed, but scarcely anyone touched their plates. A death, especially one of violent and uncertain cause, unsettled even the hungriest of stomachs. Inspector Graves had returned promptly from the county town with grave news. The post mortem confirmed poisoning by cyanide. Suicide, he reminded them, could not yet be ruled out. A man under strain, debts mounting, reputation crumbling, the inspector said, his voice heavy as he surveyed the breakfast table. Sir Geoffrey may have found himself cornered. "No," Diana said sharply, her dark eyes flashing. "My brother had his faults, but he was not a coward. He would never take his own life." "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple added mildly, buttering a slice of toast with great care. "In my experience, when something seems too convenient, it is very often because it is not true." The inspector gave her a stiff little bow, his expression doubtful. He was not a man easily swayed by elderly spinsters in lace collars. R.F.A. Eleanor's letters. Later that morning, Sergeant Ellison, searching through the late Geoffrey's bureau, discovered a packet of letters. They were tied with a blue ribbon, and bore the unmistakable hand of Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb. The inspector read them with raised eyebrows. They were declarations of affection, even desperation. Lines that spoke of a widow's hope of remarriage, of securing her place beside Sir Geoffrey as Lady Havisham. Some letters hinted at her jealousy of younger women. In his circle, confronted with them, Mrs. Whitcomb wept. "Yes, I loved him! Yes, I hoped, believed, he would marry me. If he did not, I should have been ruined in society's eyes, a fool of a woman clinging to a dream. But I did not kill him. Surely you must see that." Her sobs filled the drawing room. The inspector was unimpressed. But Miss Marple, from her chair by the window, observed keenly how Eleanor's grief seemed rooted less in Geoffrey's death than in her own humiliation. By Colonel Redfern's honor, the next revelation was equally damning. It emerged, whispered among the servants and confirmed by certain papers, that Geoffrey had owed the Colonel a significant sum from gambling. When Inspector Graves pressed him, Colonel Redfern flushed crimson beneath his bristling moustache. "Yes, he owed me money. But dash it all, debts of honor are settled man to man. I'd not stoop to poisoning a fellow for a handful of guineas." Miss Marple, who had seen many proud men undone by both money and reputation, noted how his pipe shook in his hand. Pride was a motive as strong as passion, but she thought it unlikely the Colonel possessed the subtlety for so quiet a crime. A soldier's temperament lent itself to more direct methods. Fifth Clara's secret. It was in the conservatory, among dripping ferns and misted glass, that Miss Marple found Clara Winthrop. The girl's eyes were swollen from tears, and she looked very young indeed, clasping a handkerchief in her trembling hands. "I cared for him," Clara whispered. "From the first moment I saw him I thought he might one day ask for my hand. But he only laughed. He called me a silly child. I cannot forgive him for that humiliation." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. "Humiliation can drive people to reckless things, my dear, but hatred and murder are not always the same." The Clara shook her head vehemently. "I never wished him dead. Only that he might regret his cruelty." Miss Marple believed her, yet the fact remained that Clara had been seen near Geoffrey's study that evening, her muffled sobs overheard. It was a thread in the tapestry she could not yet discard. Fakir Doctor. Foster's calm, the doctor alone seemed unchanged, composed, authoritative. He moved about the household offering counsel, measuring words with precision, steady as a metronome. One evening, Miss Marple engaged him in gentle conversation. "It must be a burden, doctor, to carry the health of so many upon your shoulders. A heavy responsibility." He inclined his head. "It is the calling I chose." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles clicking softly, "though I dare say it would be most awkward if one's judgment, or prescriptions, were ever called into question." Just for an instant, she saw his eyes flicker. Then the mask of composure returned. "You need not trouble yourself with such matters, madam." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, but I do so like to understand people. It makes everything so much simpler." Famdre the mirror's trick that night. Unable to sleep, Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the long corridor and its gilded mirror. The candles flickered, and the glass cast back a shimmering reflection of the hallway. From one end of the corridor, she studied the angle. The mirror revealed the drinks table, yes, but not entirely. Only the gleam of glass, the suggestion of decanters. Anyone glancing into it would believe Geoffrey had poured his own brandy. But a clever hand could have offered him the poisoned glass, unseen by those relying on the reflection. Miss Marple tapped her chin with her needles. Human beings, like mirrors, often show only part of the truth. One must look at the angle, not the surface. A fanfare second discovery, the next morning, brought a fresh disturbance. Sergeant Ellison, continuing his diligent searches, uncovered a small vial concealed behind the decanters in the dining room. Its label was missing, but its contents smelled unmistakably of almonds. Inspector Graves triumphantly declared, "Here we have it, the cyanide. Sir Geoffrey must have kept it himself, perhaps for vermin." In a moment of despair, he poured it into his drink. Suicide, plain and simple. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I think not, Inspector. Men who intend to take their own lives rarely go to such trouble to hide the evidence. And Sir Geoffrey was too vain, I think, to choose so dreadful an end." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, yet it carried an authority that gave the inspector pause. Five threads tightened. As the day wore on, tensions mounted. Diana grew more secretive, burning letters in the library. Mrs. Whitcomb hovered in corners, weeping but watchful. The colonel strode about muttering of honor and disgrace. Clara drifted like a ghost, wringing her hands. And through it all, Dr. Foster remained calm, solicitous, above suspicion. But Miss Marple knew the pattern was tightening. The widow's passion, the colonel's debts, the girl's humiliation. These were strong emotions, yet they lacked the calculated cunning the crime required. To place a poisoned glass with such subtlety, to use the mirror as an accomplice, that required not passion but cool design, and she began to suspect that beneath Dr. Foster's calm exterior lay a motive far stronger than jealousy or pride, fear of exposure. Geoffrey had known something dangerous, and for that knowledge he had paid with his life. The knitting in Miss Marple's lap grew into neat, ordered rows. She smiled faintly to herself. Yes, the design was nearly visible now. Faf acet ivia revilatium. The rain had ceased, and by evening Haversham Manor lay beneath a pale, watery moon. The gardens glistened, and in the hush of the damp night, the house seemed more than ever a stage upon which each actor played his part, though not all of them knew the script. Miss Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, was content to appear a harmless old lady nodding over her needles, but behind those shrewd blue eyes, patterns had aligned themselves at last. The poisoned brandy, the letters, the debts, the tears, the mirror, all had seemed disconnected strands. Now, at last they formed a single thread. Fafivi Miss Marple's quiet observations. It was not the passion of Mrs. Whitcomb, nor the pride of Colonel Redfern, nor the foolish longings of Clara that had ended Geoffrey's life. Such motives might drive one to rash words, but not to a crime of such careful planning. No, it was precision she had observed, and calculation. The choice of cyanide, the concealment of the vial, the manipulation of reflection. This was no crime of the heart but of the intellect. She recalled Dr. Foster's eyes flickering when she spoke of prescriptions, his insistence on composure, a man who guarded his own reputation carefully, and Geoffrey, with his careless tongue, might well have known something damaging. Copy v. Diana's confession. That evening, as the household gathered uneasily for supper, Diana slipped into Miss Marple's sitting room. Her usually stern face was pale. "I can bear it no longer," she said, clutching the arm of the chair. "You must know, Miss Marple. I burned Geoffrey's letters, not from guilt, but from shame. They revealed things about my family, our finances, things I would not have the world know." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. My dear, secrets are burdensome, but you did not kill your brother. You need not fear me. Tears sprang to Diana's eyes. Then who among us is capable of such a deed? That, Miss Marple said softly, is what we are about to discover. The 5th gathering the following evening, at Miss Marple's gentle insistence, Inspector Graves assembled the household once more in the long dining hall. The candles were lit, and their flames trembled in the gilded mirror, casting ghostly doubles of every face around the table. Miss Marple, in her lace collar and with her knitting in her lap, looked every inch the picture of innocent domesticity. Yet the hush that fell over the room seemed to center on her slight figure. I have asked you all to come together, she began, her voice mild, because the truth, like a badly dropped stitch, will not be hidden. It will work its way out, no matter how one tries to conceal it. The inspector shifted impatiently, but he said nothing. Fafri the mirror's secret. From the first, Miss Marple continued, I was struck by the position of the mirror. A curious ornament for a corridor, and one that seemed to serve little purpose. And yet, it allowed one to observe the drinks table without entering the room. A most convenient arrangement, if one wished to be seen not to tamper with the glasses, while in fact doing so. Gasps echoed around the table. Mrs. Whitcomb clutched her handkerchief. Clara gave a little sob. Yes, Miss Marple went on. Sir Geoffrey's glass was not poured by his own hand, though the mirror would suggest otherwise. Someone was clever enough to use reflection to deceive the eye. She paused, letting the words sink in. The Colonel shifted uncomfortably. The widow wept. Clara stared wide-eyed. But who, Miss Marple said, possessed both the calmness and the knowledge to use cyanide, a poison not so easily obtained, who knew how much to use, and how best to disguise its taste. Her eyes bright as steel, turned toward the doctor. The doctor's defense. Dr. Foster straightened in his chair, his composure only faintly cracked. You cannot be serious, madam. I am a man of science sworn to preserve life. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice. And yet, doctor, it is precisely such men who understand most clearly how to take it away. Sir Geoffrey was careless. He knew something about your practice. Something that might have ended your career. He would not have kept such knowledge to himself. He was not that sort of man. The doctor's eyes flickered. Nonsense. He knew nothing of the kind. On the contrary, Miss Marple said gently, he had discovered, had he not, that some of your medicines were diluted. That patients who trusted you were being deceived. He had threatened exposure, and so, you silenced him. There was a long, terrible pause. The net tightens. Inspector Graves leaned forward, his eyes hard. What say you to that, doctor? Dr. Foster gave a brittle laugh. Old wives' tales and gossip. You'd condemn a man on the word of a village spinster. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, I would never condemn. I merely notice things. That is all I have ever done. For instance, doctor, the vial was found behind the decanters, but it was you who first insisted upon searching there, and, though you are careful, I observed the faintest trace of chemical upon your cuff the morning after Sir Geoffrey's death. Bitter omens, unmistakable to those who have once encountered them. The doctor's hands clenched on the table. You dare. But Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost apologetic. One cannot hide the truth forever, doctor. Mirrors, after all, may show us what we wish to see, but they also reveal what is truly there, if we know where to look. Funvive the silence. A profound hush filled the hall. The faces reflected in the mirror seemed pale, spectral. Mrs. Whitcomb had ceased weeping, staring in shock. Clara clutched the edge of the table. The Colonel muttered an oath beneath his breath. At last, Inspector Graves rose. Dacre Foster, I must ask you to accompany me. We shall see what further evidence the Crown finds in support of Miss Marple's words. The doctor rose stiffly. His mask of composure was gone, his face white. For a moment, he seemed about to protest further, but then, with a sigh of defeat, he bowed his head. As the inspector led him from the hall, the household sat stunned. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with quiet composure. Miss Marple reflects, when all had dispersed, Diana approached her. How did you know? How could you see what none of us did? Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind. Oh, my dear, one sees a great deal when one has spent a lifetime watching people. A young girl's blush, a man's pride, a widow's tears. They are all patterns, just like stitches in my knitting, and once you see the mistake, it is so simple to put it right. She glanced once more at the gilded mirror, where the last candle flickered. It is curious, is it not, how mirrors deceive us? They show us what we expect, not always what is true. but the truth, like a dropped stitch, will out, sooner or later, and with that, Miss Marple folded her knitting, ready for the peace of the night. Vifies ACTV ras ution. The morning after Dr. Foster's removal from Havisham Manor, the household seemed lighter, as though a storm had passed. Yet unease still lingered, questions unanswered, doubts gnawing. Inspector Graves himself, though privately convinced by Miss Marple's reasoning, demanded a clearer picture. And so at his request, the household gathered once more in the library, the rain-washed windows letting in pale autumn sunlight. Miss Marple, perched on a straight-backed chair with her knitting in her lap, began in her gentle voice. Parker the final explanation. You see, it was all a matter of perspective, she said, nodding towards the long corridor beyond. That mirror gave the illusion that Sir Geoffrey had poured his own brandy. But in truth, someone else placed the poisoned glass in his hand, trusting that any witness would be deceived by the reflection. It was a clever trick, but rather too clever, for it betrayed the calculating mind behind it. She looked around the room, her expression kindly but firm. Mrs. Whitcomb's letters, the colonel's debts, young Clara's broken heart, all were motives of passion, to be sure. But none of you, I think, had the cool precision to measure out cyanide, conceal the vial, and manipulate the evidence with such patience. No, this was a crime of knowledge and design, and who in our circle possessed both the knowledge of poisons and the calm to employ them? Only Dr. Foster. Clara gave a small gasp. Diana clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Miss Marple continued, Sir Geoffrey was a careless man but not a fool. He had discovered irregularities in the doctor's practice. Some medicines diluted, some charges inflated. In a small village, such a scandal would have ruined Dr. Foster utterly. Geoffrey threatened exposure, and for that, he sealed his fate. The colonel gave a low whistle. By Jove, so that was it. Be funfully clearing the shadows. Mrs. Whitcomb dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief. Then I am not suspected. Miss Marple smiled. Your letters betrayed only your heart, my dear. Love can make fools of us all, but it did not make you a murderess. Clara whispered. And they said I was near his study that night. Eh? Miss Marple said kindly. You were near, yes, but only in tears. Many a young girl has mistaken admiration for love. It is a lesson learned in time, though sadly at a cost here. You had no part in Geoffrey's death. Clara flushed, half in shame, half in relief. And you, Colonel, Miss Marple said, turning her eyes to him, you lost at cards, as so many have. Pride may sting, but debts of honor do not make poisoners of gentlemen. The Colonel harumphed, looking simultaneously chastened and relieved. Diana rose, her face pale but composed. Then it is true. My brother's folly and the doctor's pride have brought this misery upon us all. Indeed. Miss Marple murmured. But families endure. Miss Havisham, they always do. Found Fethery Inspector Graves' admission. The inspector cleared his throat. I must admit, Miss Marple, I doubted you at the start. But your reasoning is most sound. The chemist's records already show Foster purchased compounds sufficient to make cyanide, though he claimed they were for animal use. The Crown will no doubt make its case. You have done us all a service. Miss Marple gave a modest smile. Oh, I merely observed. Life in St. Mary Mead teaches one that people are rarely what they appear. A quarrel in a shop, a smile at a FT, these are but reflections, like that mirror in the corridor. But the truth, Inspector, always peeps through in the smallest of things. 5. Restoring calm. In the days that followed, Havisham Manor began to breathe again. The servants went about their duties with steadier hands, the curtains were drawn back, and the air of dread lifted. Diana, though somber, walked in the gardens once more, her upright figure a symbol of endurance. Mrs. Whitcomb departed quietly, her pride wounded but her reputation intact. Clara returned to her mother in the village, her youthful heart already beginning to heal. As for Colonel Redfern, he left with brisk handshakes, his moustache bristling, declaring that honor, though dented, had survived intact. And Miss Marple returned to her cottage in St. Mary Mead, to her roses and her knitting and her afternoon teas, as though nothing remarkable had happened at all. Pfeifferis Miss Marple reflects one evening, as she sat by her fireside with her faithful kettle whistling, Miss Marple allowed herself a gentle reflection. Human beings, she murmured, are much like mirrors. They reflect what they wish the world to see, dignity, affection, despair. But tilt the angle a little, and the truth will show itself. One has only to watch carefully. She poured her tea, added just a touch of milk, and smiled faintly. After all, she added, speaking as much to the crackling fire as to herself, there is no great mystery in murder, only human nature. dressed up in a glass that flatters. And with that, she took up her knitting once more, the pattern neat and precise, the dropped stitches set right, the village world restored to order. The end.